Deb of the Planet E and Me podcast. Today in this video, we're sharing the history of climate change. And this video is a little different than ones you may have seen before because we're sharing the story through words and music with the help of my friend, violinist Linda Beers. And our hope is, of course, that you'll learn something new, but even more importantly, that you'll be inspired to take action. I've always felt this strong connection with nature. Hiking and camping, those were some of the best times of my childhood. I loved to explore the woods. They were where I felt most alive. In college, I traveled to Costa Rica for a 4-week tropical field study. We spent most of our time in the Monteverde cloud forest, which is a place like no other. In this one small spot, you can find more types of orchids than almost anywhere in the world. There are also species that are found nowhere else in the world. One of these endemic species was the golden toad, a bright orange toad about 2 inches long. One night, a few students from our group decided to hike up to a spot where they could observe the toads. I don't know if I was too lazy or too tired, but for whatever reason, I didn't go. The year was 1987. By the time I finished college 3 years later, in 1990, the golden toad had become extinct. So there wouldn't be another opportunity to see them. Not for me, not for anyone. Fast forward to today. Not too long ago, I learned that climate change and deforestation are causing drier conditions in Monteverde. The drier conditions are affecting cloud formation, which means that the cloud forest itself is in danger of disappearing. This is just one of the many results of climate change. We live in this very special, very unique place. Earth is home to every known species in our solar system. We're basically on this little ball of life circling a rather ordinary star in a vast galaxy of swirling gas and dust. As astronaut Ron Garan put it, Earth is an oasis against the backdrop of infinity. One thing that becomes clear with a shuttle's eye view is how fragile the planet is. From our earthbound view, the sky seems limitless, but that's just an illusion. At its thickest spots, the atmosphere is only 300 to 600 miles wide. 300 miles. That's less than the distance from Boston to Philadelphia. And we are changing the composition of this blanket of gases in a way that is impacting every ecological system on Earth. So here's the deal. We all learned in school that the atmosphere is made of gases, mostly nitrogen and oxygen, then really small amounts of other stuff. Carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and water vapor. Those are part of the other stuff, and those are the greenhouse gases. And we need these gases to trap heat, otherwise the Earth would be unlivable, just a frozen popsicle. The problem we have now is that the amount of greenhouse gases has increased. They're trapping too much heat. Let's travel back in time to the PreIndustrial era to understand how we got started down this road. Let's start this story at the beginning, shall we? You're probably thinking Industrial Revolution, but nope, we need to go back farther than that. Keep going, keep going. There, that's perfect. 12,000 years ago this story started, and I'll tell you why that's significant in a minute. But for our purposes, we're going to call everything from 12,000 years ago to 1750 pre-industrial. To represent this time period, Linda will play the Summer Concerto from Antonio Vivaldi's masterpiece, The Four Seasons. Now you might be thinking, why this song of all the songs during this time period? Well, if you listen carefully, you can hear insects and birds and a fierce storm. It is the perfect song to represent the pre-industrial period. It reminds us of the power of nature.
For over 200,000 years, humans were hunter-gatherers. Populations were small. Around 12,000 years ago, everything changes. Humans learn that they can control certain aspects of nature. They learn how to domesticate animals and grow plants. This is the beginning of agriculture. This Vivaldi piece is telling of a shepherd out guarding his flock. By the time Vivaldi writes this piece, people had already been farming for 10,000 years. Farming allowed people to settle in one place. Towns and cities grew up, populations expanded, civilizations began. This came with both good and bad. We have this picture of farming as quaint and idyllic, but the practice of agriculture, depending on how it's done, can have dramatic impacts on the landscape and even the climate. Over this period, people cleared huge swaths of land, often through slash and burn methods. When you cut down a tree, that means there's one less live tree absorbing carbon dioxide. If you then go and burn that tree, you're releasing carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. Remember those greenhouse gases that we talked about before? Each acre of forest burn can produce 450 tons of carbon dioxide gas. Ice core samples from Antarctica and fossil evidence suggest that 7,000 to 5,000 years ago, humans were already starting to warm the climate. Not only was carbon dioxide increasing, but agriculture was also producing methane by way of farm animals and later the introduction of rice paddies. When people talk about natural gas, they are euphemistically referring to methane. Over the short term, methane is many times more potent than carbon dioxide at trapping heat. The increase in rice production was so significant that between 750 CE and 1100 CE, it allowed the population of China to double from 50 million to 100 million. But wait, we've jumped ahead a bit. Even before this time, populations were expanding, people were developing specialized work and looking for new energy sources and other natural resources. The Chinese people built the first coal mines 3,000 years ago. Coal is the Earth's most common fossil fuel. It is mainly used to produce heat. A short time after that, the Chinese built bamboo pipelines to transport natural gas as a source of energy. Many ancient civilizations expanded their resource use without regard for the environment. Lead mining in ancient Rome was at levels equivalent to those of the Industrial Revolution. They used lead for water pipes, coins, utensils, and even as an additive for wine. Their air was so heavily polluted from this and other activities that they referred to it by a name that meant heavy heaven. We know this from writings of the time, but also there is again evidence from ice cores showing increased amounts of lead particles and methane during Roman times. The transition from wood burning to coal burning was hurried along by widespread deforestation occurring at different times throughout history. The Chinese moved to coal as a main source of fuel over 1,000 years ago, at a time when coal mining was just beginning in Britain. By 1500 CE, the Chinese were digging oil and gas wells that were many hundreds of feet deep. Worldwide population, deforestation, and agriculture continued to increase. Britain was so deforested by the 1700s, it had to rely on the American colonies and other areas for its major lumber needs. One British ship could require 6,000 full-grown oaks. Interestingly, renewable energy sources were also being used in the pre-industrial period as well. The Greeks built the first passive solar communities 2,400 years ago. Many civilizations have been using hydropower for over 2,000 years. And over 1,000 years ago, Persians invented vertical axis windmills to take advantage of wind power. Some of these ancient windmills still run today. In the 1700s, the Maori people were using geothermal energy for cooking and heating. Around 1710, Thomas Newcomen invented the atmospheric engine, a type of steam engine. Steam would become the driving force of the Industrial Revolution to come. Let's recap for a moment. By the time the pre-industrial period was at its end, humans had deforested over 1 billion acres of temperate forest, an area over half the size of the continental U.S. They developed fossil fuel technology to use coal, oil, and natural gas, and some scientists believe that they increased carbon dioxide and methane at a scale large enough to cause global climate change. They also had tapped into the power of solar, wind, water, and geothermal sources. Then came the Industrial Revolution of the mid-18th century. It started in Great Britain with its mills and massive clanking machinery. This machinery was soon powered by steam engines, and these engines ran on coal. Lots and lots of coal. The mining of coal left its mark on the countryside, and the combustion of coal left its mark everywhere else. Soot covered buildings and blackened skies, but it was the price that the growing middle class and wealthy were willing to pay. The extension of the railroad and new technologies opened the door to so many possibilities. Many people's lives were enriched by the Industrial Revolution, but for others, this was not the case. Coal miners, laborers, and factory workers found themselves working 12 to 16 hours a day at dangerous, low-paying jobs. Still, industrialization spread across Europe. The Romantic movement started in part as a response to all of this. The Romantics felt that society's industrialization was causing people to lose their connection with nature, and really to lose part of what it meant to be human. Poets and painters created great works describing the beauty of nature. Beethoven is perhaps the best known of the Romantic composers. What you might not know about him is that, like many of the poets and artists of the time, he felt strongly about nature. He spent most of his life in Vienna. At the time, the city was filled with political turmoil, masses of people, and hundreds of factories. Life was made even more stressful for Beethoven because of his hearing loss. He escaped when he could to the countryside. In his diary, he once wrote, "No one can love the countryside more than I do, for the woods, the trees, and the rocks give a man the inspiration he needs." Like the time he lived in, Beethoven was filled with genius and creativity. His symphonies were bigger and bolder. Thanks to innovations during the Industrial Revolution, instruments themselves became more complex. Valves and other features allowed musicians to play more pitches, to play faster, and in some cases louder. The Industrial Revolution allowed Beethoven to take his compositions from imagination to reality. The 4 notes that open Beethoven's Fifth Symphony are instantly recognizable, full of force and power. But Beethoven could also write sweet lyrical music. Today we will hear Romance in F. This piece is an interesting contrast to the pace of development during the Industrial Revolution. I don't know what inspired it, but you can almost imagine Beethoven roaming the picturesque countryside as the music comes to him. The birth of the textile industry in Great Britain set the Industrial Revolution in motion. With innovations like the flying shuttle and the spinning jenny in the mid-18th century, machine-made goods began to replace handmade goods. From 1765 through the 1780s, James Watt improved the steam engine. The impact was tremendous. Coal was used to power the steam engines that powered the machines of the Industrial Revolution. In 1802 in Great Britain, the first steam locomotive was invented, followed by the first passenger line in 1825. In just a few decades, 13,000 miles of railway opened up in Great Britain, allowing the delivery of more coal to factories and growing cities. Coal consumption in 1860s Britain was enormous. The expansion of coal fields required an expanded labor force. The country's poor kept the coal coming and the machines running. Children as young as 5 worked in the mines. In the U.S. at the same time, wood was the main energy source used for steam-powered vehicles. There were 1,200 steamboats operating on the Mississippi River alone in the 1830s. One steamboat could use 90 large trees a day. Elijah Otis introduced his safety elevator in 1853. The installation of passenger elevators allowed buildings to grow taller. Around the same time, Sir Henry Bessemer filed his patent for the Bessemer process. This process allowed for the cheap mass production of steel. The Industrial Revolution in the U.S. was fired up further a few years later. In 1859, Colonel Edwin Drake drilled the first oil well in the U.S. in Titusville, Pennsylvania. But it would be a few more years before the oil industry really took off. The shift to fossil fuels in the 1860s was not to oil, but to coal. Like in Great Britain, coal became the primary fuel in the U.S. They didn't know it at the time, but fossil fuels came with a hidden cost. Today's Antarctic ice cores reveal an increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide during the Industrial Revolution. Something else happened during this time that is almost lost in all of the commotion. In 1839, Edmund Becquerel created the first photovoltaic cell. Photovoltaic cells convert the sun's energy into an electric current. The principle is the foundation of today's solar panels, but it would be another century before the world's first modern solar cell was patented. What can we say about the Industrial Revolution? It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. Dickens was speaking of the French Revolution when he wrote these words, but we could just as easily apply them to the Industrial Revolution. So much incredible technology, no one can deny that, but it came with a price. True success is that place where the economy, equality, and the environment intersect. And in the case of the Industrial Revolution, equality and environment were left behind. The result, we now know, from a climate perspective, is that there was an increase in the rate of carbon dioxide entering the atmosphere. A change that took potentially thousands of years in the pre-industrial period was now happening in a century.
Industrialization marched on in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and what music better epitomizes this fast-paced development than ragtime? Ragtime was uniquely American with its mix of classical and march and the syncopation of African music. Now, Scott Joplin didn't invent ragtime, but he helped elevate the form and bring it to a wider audience. Young people of the time especially loved it. It represented that energy of the urbanizing environment. But not everything was ideal during those times. This time was known as the Gilded Age. It was a time when great wealth was accumulating in the hands of just a few, J.P. Morgan, Carnegie, Rockefellers, and the like, and they were making their money off the backs of working poor. Now, Scott Joplin was born shortly after the Civil War, and he saw how hard his parents worked. His mother was a domestic servant, his father was a laborer for the railroad, and he wanted something different for himself. And he'd been learning piano since a young age, and as a teenager he left home and became an itinerant musician, working anywhere he could get a job, in minstrel shows and saloons, and this is where he learned ragtime. Eventually, he started taking college classes so that he could properly notate the music, and he published the Maple Leaf Rag in 1899. It became extremely popular, and within 10 years, Scott Joplin was known as the King of Ragtime, with over 40 compositions to his name. Unfortunately, his fame didn't last, and he died in Harlem at the age of 49, shortly before the Harlem Renaissance. But in his short lifetime, Scott Joplin saw the invention of the telephone, the phonograph, stainless steel, ballpoint pens, the zipper, vacuum cleaners, vacuum tubes, the airplane, and so much more. He saw the Transcontinental Railroad completed and electricity put into people's homes. And all of this progress required fuel, and the fuel of the time was coal and oil.
A growing middle class continued to create demand for goods. The Gilded Age is a time of technological innovation in communication, transportation, and manufacturing. This 1895 film is one of the first of its kind. It shows workers leaving a factory in France. Industrialization in the U.S., particularly in the Northeast, expanded rapidly at the turn of the century. Industry was supported by massive waves of immigration. 12 million immigrants arrived between 1870 and 1900. The transport of materials was made possible by the growth of the railroads. By 1870, they reached clear across the country. The final part of the Transcontinental Railroad was laid largely by Chinese immigrants working in dangerous conditions for $27 a month. Resentment of Chinese workers increased. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act prohibited immigration of Chinese laborers to the U.S. In the 1880s, the first electric light bulbs began to make their way into homes. In 1882, the world's first coal-powered electric generating station came online in London. In 1883, the Brooklyn Bridge opened. It was the longest suspension bridge in the world and symbolized the growth of the nation. In Europe, new types of automobiles began to appear. In 1884, a practical electric car was invented by Thomas Parker. Carl Benz built the precursor to the modern gas-powered vehicle. In 1888, his wife Bertha takes the first road trip. The invention of the internal combustion engine in the 1880s provided a new market for petroleum. Oil production continued to expand with the first offshore drilling beginning in California in 1896. In 1900, there were just 8,000 cars in the U.S. In 1920, there were over 9 million, in large part due to the affordability of the Model T Ford. Diesel and gas-powered vehicles would eventually become an important source of greenhouse gas pollution. In 1903, the Wright brothers invented the airplane. Today, plane travel accounts for 11% of greenhouse gas emissions from the U.S. transportation sector. With the start of World War I, the Great Migration began. African Americans moved north to take jobs in the factories and to escape Jim Crow laws of the South. They encountered racism in the North too, and were often forced to take more dangerous jobs for less pay. They worked in factories, foundries, and slaughterhouses. The average lifespan decreased for African Americans living in northern cities. Industry marched on. Cities like Pittsburgh, a leader in steel production at the turn of the century, consumed massive amounts of coal. As before, progress came with a price. It is during this time that scientists start to realize that there's a problem. A Swedish chemist, Svante Arrhenius, calculated that the increased carbon dioxide from the burning coal would cause global temperatures to rise significantly. This was 1896. Over a century ago, they began to suspect there was a problem. This graph of ice core data shows the increase in the rate of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere during the Second Industrial Revolution. Notice that the curve is getting steeper. So they were just beginning to understand the toll they were taking on the climate. But there was certainly another toll that they knew well, and that was the thousands and thousands of people that died building the railways and the buildings, manufacturing the goods, and producing the coal. At the peak of coal production in 1920, there were 784,621 U.S. miners producing over 600 million tons of coal a year. In Great Britain, there were over 1 million coal miners.
A miner's life is like a sailor's. Board a ship to cross the waves. Every day his life's in danger, many ventures being brave. Watch the rocks, they're falling daily. Careless miners always fail. Keep your hand upon your wages and your eye upon the scale. Union miners stand together. Do not heed the coal board's tale. Keep your hand upon your wages and your eye upon the scale. You've been docked and docked again, boys. You've been loading 3 for 1. What's the use in all your working when your mining days are done? Worn out shoes and worn out miners, blackened lungs and faces pale. Keep your hand upon your wages and your eye upon the scale. Union miners, stand together. Do not heed the coal board's tale. Keep your hand upon your wages and your eye upon the scale. In conclusion, bear in memory, keep this password in your mind. Worker strength cannot be broken when unions be combined. Stand up tall and stand together. Victory for you prevail. Keep your hand upon your wages and your eye upon the scale. Union miners, stand together. Do not heed the coal board's tale. Keep your hand upon your wages and your eye upon the scale. Union miners, stand together. Do not heed the coal board's tale. Keep your hand upon your wages and your eye upon the scale.
In the U.S. between 1870 and 1914, there were over 52,000 coal mining fatalities. Fatalities resulting from accidents are fewer today, but black lung disease is actually on the rise again in the U.S. Government research shows that the incidence of black lung disease has been increasing since 2000 in the U.S. As many as 1 in 5 miners in central Appalachia exhibit signs of the disease. Conditions are much worse for miners in China, where millions are still employed in the coal mines and hundreds die in mining accidents each year. Many think of coal as a bygone industry in the U.S., but we are still the 3rd largest coal consumer in the world. Over a quarter of our electric generation still comes from coal. The average American uses about 10,000 kilowatt hours of electricity per year. If even 25% of that comes from coal, that would mean that each of us is using the equivalent of 1 ton of coal annually.
In our lifetimes, we've seen damage to the environment skyrocket. We're consuming more than ever before, and we've put an increasing reliance on fossil fuels. The result is that we have profoundly damaged natural systems. But now, people are coming up with some very unique ways to bring awareness to the situation. One of those projects comes to us from the University of Minnesota, where they're taking climate data and changing it into music.
We know the Earth is warming, but some places have warmed up faster than others. Our changing climate is often illustrated with maps like this one from NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies. But visual representations are not the only way we can chart the geography of global warming. My name is Dan Crawford, and I'm a student at the University of Minnesota. I've been working with Dr. Scott St. George, who's a professor in the Department of Geography, to turn climate data into climate music. It's written for string quartet and uses all 4 instruments to describe the pace and the place of global warming. We've asked students from the University of Minnesota's School of Music to perform the piece, and also to help explain how we turned 135 years of thermometer measurements into music. The cello matches the temperature of the equatorial zone. The viola tracks the mid-latitudes, and the 2 violins separately match the temperatures of the high latitudes and the Arctic. the pitch of each note is tuned to the average annual temperature of that region. So a really low note on the cello means the equatorial zone was cold that year. And a really high note on the violin means warm weather stretching across the Arctic. When we blend the four instruments, the four regions together, you're able to hear quite clearly how temperatures fluctuate across the globe, from the equator to the North Pole. And if we start the performance in 1880 and end at the present, you can hear how much temperatures have increased and what regions have warmed the most. This is our newest composition, Planetary Band's Warming World.
In the 1930s, the U.S. government repurposed World War I nitrate factories. Instead of being used to make explosives, the nitrate was now used to make fertilizers. Chemical companies also began to make pesticides. Soon, chemical use became widespread in agriculture. Farming transitioned from small family farms to large-scale monocropping, which relied heavily upon these chemicals. Excess fertilizer use results in the production of nitrous oxide, a gas many times more potent than carbon dioxide. Pesticide use also leads to greenhouse gas emissions. After World War II, consumerism was considered patriotic. More oil and raw materials were needed to create more goods. In 1949, Halliburton created the first commercial use of hydraulic fracturing, aka fracking. Fracking is the process of using a high-pressure injection of fluid into rock to more easily release gas and oil. Millions of gallons of water are used for each well. The fracking fluid contains hundreds of highly toxic chemicals. Now, over 1 million wells in the U.S. have been fracked. In the 1950s, tropical deforestation began. Over a third of the world's tropical forests have been lost. In the 1950s, scientists began to warn the U.S. government about greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. They stated that if carbon dioxide continued to rise at the rate it was going, the average temperature would increase 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit every 100 years for centuries to come. In the 1960s, coal companies began to replace underground mining with mountaintop removal, using explosives to remove entire mountaintops. On January 28, 1969, an oil well off the coast of California began to spill millions of gallons of oil. The spill killed thousands of seabirds, dolphins, seals, and sea lions. This disaster sparked activism and environmental legislation in the 1970s. In the 1980s, deep water oil drilling began. These wells were producing over 10,000 barrels a day. In the 1990s, extraction of tar sands in Canada began in earnest. An area larger than the state of West Virginia is leased to fossil fuel companies. Massive amounts of toxic waste sludge are left across formerly pristine woodland. This extraction process produces 3,600 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare mined and uses millions of gallons of water each day. The damage to the climate from frack gas extraction and production is almost as great as that of coal. Gas pipeline approvals were up 70% in 2017 in the northeastern U.S. Scientists believe that burning the oil currently in world reserves would be catastrophic for the Earth. Oil companies refuse to change course because it would leave them with stranded assets. They have spent millions and millions of dollars on climate misinformation campaigns. Taxpayers subsidize the oil industry by $20 billion a year. Indirect costs to society have been calculated at $5.3 trillion a year. Then there's a matter of population. In 1800, the world population was just 1 billion. By 2000, it had grown to 6 billion. Today, we are at 7.5 billion and counting. Carbon dioxide levels have risen dramatically since the Industrial Revolution. Rising carbon dioxide has climate consequences. Average global temperatures are rising. The number of extremely hot days is increasing. Scientists have been monitoring the sun's output since 1978. There has been very little change. Warming trends cannot be explained by increased solar output. The facts are clear. Humans are causing climate change. Who agrees? But you don't have to take their word for it. You can see for yourself. The temperatures are warmer. I've even seen dandelions growing in December in New England. Storms are stronger and weather is more variable than when I was growing up. Climate change is not something that's happening in the distant future. It's happening now. Lives are already being lost to climate change related disasters. In 2003, Europe experienced its greatest heat wave since the 1500s. Over 14,000 people in France died of heat-related conditions. The death toll throughout Europe was closer to 70,000. Increasing temperatures suck water out of the soil. Many parts of the world are facing extreme drought. From 2006 to 2011, Syria experienced a drought so severe that 75% of the farms failed and 85% of the livestock died. The Northern Hemisphere is warming faster than other parts of the globe. Drying forests are burning at a rate not seen in at least 10,000 years. In August 2018, the Carr wildfire became the largest in California history. Glaciers are melting, and sea ice is weakening. Sea levels are rising. The 22 island nations of the South Pacific create only a tiny fraction of world greenhouse gases, but are 3 times more likely to be impacted by severe climate change. As their islands are submerged by rising seas, crops are inundated by salt water, and fresh water is becoming scarcer. Recently, their leaders implored other world leaders to make change.
The existential threat of climate change is becoming more real with every hurricane, every wildfire, heat wave, centimeter of sea level rise.
Climate change has become an existential threat not only to the lives of people in island states, but the world as a whole. As islanders, we live this stark reality every day.
These are not new observations. We have been grappling with these challenges for decades.
Small island developing states are indeed making great strides in transforming their energy systems, while Palau emits a minuscule fraction of the global aggregate. We believe that the example we set can inspire many others to act. Smokestacks have no place in paradise.
Ocean temperatures are warming. Higher temperatures mean more energy. Storms are becoming more severe. Typhoon Haiyan in 2013 was the most powerful typhoon on record. Over 6,000 people died and 1.9 million became homeless. Wet microbursts, sometimes called rain bombs, are becoming more common. The heaviest rainfall events in the Northeast have increased in precipitation by 71% since 1958. Oceans are becoming more acidic as they absorb greater amounts of CO2. Oceans have become 30% more acidic since the Industrial Revolution. As oceans warm and become more acidic, coral reefs are dying. Climate change affects human health as well. In addition to the medical problems and deaths resulting from natural disasters, we see increased spread of disease, worsening of allergies and asthma, mental health impairment, and it can even aggravate cardiac-related issues. Humans have dramatically increased the rate of species extinction. Scientists consider us to be in the 6th mass extinction. Climate change is expected to increase extinction rates. In 2000, the scimitar oryx went extinct in the wild. Many other species could follow as human populations expand and habitat is further compromised by changing climate conditions. From 2010 through 2016, over 140 million people were displaced by climate and weather-related disasters. The UN predicts that there will be 300 million more climate refugees by mid-century. In 2015, youth filed a lawsuit against the U.S. government, charging that the U.S.'s failure in regards to climate change is destroying their rights to life, liberty, and happiness. As of the release of this video, the case is still pending. However, U.S. District Judge Ann Aiken has allowed the case to proceed, and she stated, "Exercising my reasoned judgment, I have no doubt that the right to a climate system capable of sustaining human life is fundamental to a free and ordered society." It's very easy to get depressed when you understand what's happening, but instead we need to focus on all that is hopeful and let that be our inspiration for taking action. I see children across the world speaking up about climate change. In November 2018, at age 15, Greta Thunberg initiated the school strike for climate. Over 50,000 people participated. If these young people can step up and call for change, why can't we all?
Linda introduced me to the music of Jay and Molly Ungar, and I think it's perfect. Jay's kind of an unexpected guy. He grew up in the Bronx, but he plays and composes folk music, and he's also a lover of nature. He helps to run the Ashokan Center, New York State's oldest environmental center. Ken Burns used one of Jay Ungar's pieces called Ashokan Farewell in his Civil War documentary, and he said of Jay and Molly that they played music from the heart, which reminds us of the best in all of us. And honestly, that's what solving this problem of climate change is going to take. It's going to take the best in all of us. So to inspire us, Linda is going to play one of Jay's pieces called Mountain House.
Costa Rica has become the first country to ban fossil fuels. Its goal is to use 100% renewables by 2021. Ireland is the first country to divest from fossil fuels. Also, many universities around the world are beginning to divest as a result of student pressure. Many countries plan to phase out gas and diesel vehicles. Car companies are producing cars with longer ranges, charge sharing, and even solar power. Electric is in. Several electric planes are in design phase. Norway wants all of its short-haul flights to be electric by 2040. Many countries like Chile and Germany are investing heavily in solar. Innovations in clean energy are happening all the time. Chalmers University of Technology in Sweden has developed a liquid that stores solar energy. It is reusable and releases energy without releasing greenhouse gases. Scientists are also working on ways to recapture carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and convert it into useful energy or other useful products. In Africa and other developing areas of the world, they are leapfrogging over fossil fuel-powered electrical grids to pay-as-you-go off-grid solar systems. Wind power has improved significantly with better turbines and better siting. This means greater energy production with fewer costs to birds and bats. The U.S. Energy Department estimates the wind industry will employ over 600,000 workers over the next 30 years. Batteries are improving. Solid-state batteries will be smaller, safer, cheaper, and higher capacity. Better battery systems will allow for increased range in electric vehicles and other electrically powered systems. Permaculture is planting based on designs in nature using a variety of annuals and perennials. It can give larger yields without chemical fertilizers and pesticides and using less water. Vertical ocean farming is starting to take hold, growing kelp and various shellfish. Ocean farming can provide large amounts of nutritious foods and help to restore the ocean. Countries around the world are beginning to ban single-use plastics. Cutting out single-use plastic will reduce fossil fuel use and the greenhouse gases released in their production. Reducing food waste is critical to cutting emissions. France passed a law making it illegal for grocery markets to throw away usable food. Concrete production is a big source of greenhouse gas emissions. Companies are working on carbon-negative concrete which is actually injected with carbon dioxide, and also limestone-free cement. Retrofitting buildings so they are energy efficient will save millions of dollars and reduce greenhouse gases. The retrofit of the Empire State Building has resulted in a 38% reduction in energy use and will result in 100,000 tons fewer greenhouse gas emissions over the next 15 years. Buildings incorporating renewable energy are a must for the future. Net zero buildings produce as much energy as they use. Many cities are improving public transport, building better waste management, supporting vertical farming and rooftop wind and solar. They are creating efficiency and saving energy through district-wide heating and cooling systems, LED lighting, and green roofs. The choice is ours. Sometimes you only get one chance.
There's no doubt that climate change is by far the greatest issue of our times. It's a complex problem that affects every aspect of our lives, and though we didn't start this process, it's been going on for a very long time. The change is happening more and more rapidly. Like it or not, we need to be the heroes of this story. So now comes the how-to part. First of all, step 1, make some room in your life for greatness. If everyone in the world just took 2 hours a week, that's not very much, just 2 hours, and spent it working on issues of climate change, together, worldwide, we would be spending over 10 billion hours a week on solving this problem. So think of the potential of that. Step 2, give from your strengths. Write down all of your talents and interests, and don't be shy about it. Now is not the time for modesty. We need everybody's talents to get this solved. And then think about where these interests and talents intersect. And that is a place that might really have some possibilities. Step 3 is to take steps big and little. So take actions of significance and take them at all different levels. For most of us, it's easiest to make change at the individual level, but that's not enough. We need to be making change at every level, from individual to community, with our faith groups and our workplace and our town, and then also at the state and federal levels, and even the global levels. If you think about it, we can all write letters to companies that need to do better. You can even write to heads of state. What's stopping you? And step 4 is to stay informed. Learn about these issues. Learn about them in your town, in your state, what's going on. And then once you know, help spread the word to other people. I think the most influence comes from friends and family members, more than even politicians and the Pope even. So spread the word, stay informed, and just know that together, all of us working together, we can do this.